Are you ready, Erica? I'm ready, Ash. Standing on the walkway that lead up to the Celadon City Pokémon Gym, Ash and Erica stared each other down with intensity written across their faces. It had been 2 weeks since the debacle at the gym and the burning of Erica's business, and in that time, much had occurred. Staying true to their words, Ash and his friends helped Erica and her employees out at the Soladonia boutique with the large influx of business they had experienced ever since the fire. Also in that time, a team of cleanup and repair crew workers had been working hard and steadily at both cleaning up, as well as fixing the vast damage done to Erica's gym. Having known that his battle with Erica would be approaching at some point, Ash had also taken to training with his Pokémon, Misty, Giselle and Soledad as hard as they could in preparation for what he knew was to come. Together, he and the 2 younger females of their traveling group had worked together at pushing themselves and their Pokémon to the limits, while Soledad and her own Pokémon focused on drilling Ash and his team on rigorous contest drills. While it may have been true that he had a gym battle approaching and not a contest, Ash still couldn't deny that the graceful skills and physical enhancements contest training had on his Pokémon would be an invaluable tool in their own battles. And this particular one about to take place would hopefully be an indicator of that. While there were definitely many other tales to tell of their accomplishments and adventures over the previous 2 weeks, they were far better saving for a time soon in the future, since the battle about to take place was set to surely be one to remember. Given that the gym was still not in any fit shape to host battles inside, Ash and Erica had come to an agreement on battling outside on the tree-lined walkway, with Delilah, one of the oldest termed employees and friends of Erica herself, acting as the presiding referee for the match. Both of their selected Pokémon already out on the field, a well-trained looking Weepinbell for Erica and Oddish for Ash, the 2 trainers sized one another up and stared each other down. All traces of sweetness on Erica's end vanished entirely from her face. For Oddish, it was rather easy to see that she was nervous. Being her first battle, the young grass type only had battle experience with her fellow Pokémon belonging to Ash, and after all, training itself only went so far. The real deal was always far more nerve-wracking. Earlier in the day, before the match, Ash had sat down with Oddish and tried to give her a good pep talk, informing the grass Pokémon that rather she won or lost, he would be proud of her and to just focus on doing her best and having confidence in herself instead of feeling nervous. Still, even he knew that words were easier said than action was to take, and the upcoming battle would be a large stretch to see just how adept Oddish was at competitive battling. As soon as Delilah gave the command for the battle to start and Erica, moving rapidly, yelled for her Pokémon to use Vine Whip, Ash knew Oddish was in for a rough battle. This being due to the sheer speed at which the twin vines moved at. Rocketing towards her like Pidgeys in competition for a Weedle, Oddish could only look nervously as the vines encroached upon her and, in one fell swoop, knocked her legs from beneath her and then smashed into her side, effectively sending her flying back across the concrete ground painfully. Ash's friends winced at the painful-looking blow, but before he could retaliate, Weepinbell was already bouncing high into the air and then descending down towards Oddish at breakneck speeds. Oddish, roll out of the way. Ash yelled. Use your head leaves to propel yourself back. His words fell on deaf ears though. So intimidated was she by the sight of Weepinbell dropping down at her that Oddish was frozen, unable to move from her grounded position. Within seconds the large Pokémon slammed down onto her and elicited a painful sounding shriek from Oddish. The sound made Ash himself wince, but what followed, Erica calling for Weepinbell to use Razor Leaf, was even worse. Flipping the leaves on its side quickly, Weepinbell began firing off multiple razor-sharp leaves down onto its opponent, which served the purpose of cutting shallow gashes into her skin while she merely laid there and cried out in pain. Seconds later, on its trainer's command, Weepinbell jumped back and grabbed onto Oddish once more with its vines before slinging her around in circles and then tossing the smaller Pokémon back across the ground. As she skidded to a halt at Ash's feet, he held his hands up and shouted, "Oddish, you can't give up. I know you're nervous, but you need to stand up and fight for yourself. You have the strength and you have the ability, now stand up and show it. To everybody, come on. Pikachu Pie. Pikachu cried out in encouragement from beside of Ash while shaking his fists towards his teammate. Pikachu Pai Pai. Pika. Odd dish. Odd. The shy and demure little Pokémon grunted as she slowly made the effort to stand up. With one eye closed and several marks on her body which were already lightly oozing green chlorophyll, a grass-type Pokémon's blood, she stared at her opponent while panting lightly. As Oddish looked at Weepinbell and really focused on Ash's words, all of the memories of her former trainer and how he had abandoned her in the woods just because he thought she was weak, much like all of her other companions from the hidden village had been by their own trainers, came rushing back to her. While Oddish wasn't a vengeful Pokémon by any stretch of the word, she was still just a normal Pokémon and even she had her limits. And it wasn't just her former trainer that had ridiculed and put her down either but also all of his other Pokémon as well. With every lost battle and every beating she took in every battle he ever forced her into, no matter how lacking her training was, the humiliation and jeering taunts only grew worse. As a young Pokémon, her confidence and self-worth were shattered before they ever had a chance to grow. For so long after her abandonment Oddish felt worthless, weakened like a total failure. In fact, it wasn't until Ash came along that, much like her friends, he had started helping her truly see just how valuable she was and how much potential she truly possessed. Both he and his other Pokémon never put her down, never joked at her inability to viciously battle like other Pokémon and, instead, talked her up and supported her at every turn. Under Ash, much like the now evolved Victreebel and the others, Oddish had finally learned what it was like to have a trainer who loved, respected and did everything they could to better her own interests and abilities at every single chance given. For Oddish, now, fighting against an opponent that was clearly more experienced and stronger was truly unnerving. She would freely admit that. Although, with the love and compassion that she felt for her trainer, and with Ash and Pikachu cheering her on from the sidelines, she simply refused to let them down. Also, the feelings of suffering yet another beatdown in her very first battle with her new trainer were bringing feelings of anger and rage bubbling to the surface. A rare and foreign emotion to her that, while not directed at Erica or her Weepinbell, by proxy in a form really actually was. Right now, as she stared down her foe, all Oddish could think of was the jeering remarks of her former trainer and his Pokémon. The hurtful remarks, cruel jokes and abuse when she failed to do something right. All of that combined with her absolute refusal to be defeated and let Ash down had the small little Pokémon's emotions set to explode on overcharge. Eyes narrowing and mouth creasing tightly shut, Oddish soon gave a loud cry of, "Oddish!" and then lunged at Weepinbell. The surprise that Oddish was back on her feet and attacking them was evident on Erica and even Weepinbell's faces, but the gym leader was experienced enough not to let shock get to her as she quickly commanded, Weepinbell use Stun Spore and Vine Whip in cycle. Weep. The grass type chanted while releasing a cloud of stun-inducing spores out into the open air, followed by its vines working like a propeller on a helicopter to send a strong burst of wind behind the spore cloud, of which went quickly drifting towards Oddish. However, Ash was also fast on the draw as he yelled, "Oddish, slap your head leaves over your face and tuck into a roll." Doing as commanded, Oddish covered her nose and mouth with her head leaves and then tucked her small body into a roll as she went straight through the yellow cloud of spores coming at her. As soon as she passed through it, Oddish immediately came out of her roll with a strong kick off of her feet and flew at Weepinbell. At the speed and ferocity she was traveling at, the intent of the attack she was about to use, headbutt, was undeniable. In fact, so surprised was Weepinbell by her shift in demeanor and evasion of its attack that the fruit-bodied Pokémon was unable to avoid the full frontal assault and took the entire brunt of the brutal head bash attack right in the center of the body. Crying out in pain, the grass type went flying back across the walkway. However, Oddish was apparently far from done as she kept running for her opponent while flipping her head leaves back and forth on Ash's command. The result of this movement was obvious as several sharp leaves went hurtling up at the still airborne Pokémon and covered it a nasty barrage of the sharp green, dagger-like natural blades. As they cut deeply into her opponent's skin, Oddish jumped up into the air and Haya butted the underside of Weepinbell's body right as it began descending down towards the ground. The third attack launched the other grass type back up into the air, to which Erica finally took action on as she commanded, Weepinbell, grab onto one of those tree branches with your vines. Even through its pain, the gym leader's Pokémon was seasoned enough that it managed through said pain and sent out 2 vines from the top of its head and latched onto one of the branches of the trees that lined the walkway up to the gym. Using this newfound hold, Weepinbell pulled itself away from the ground and out of harm's way as it soared across the concrete battlefield, but then made a fast circular loop around the tree. By using the hold it had on the branch above, Erica's Pokémon rocketed itself back at Oddish and succeeded in covering ground quickly to hammer itself into her front, sending her skidding back across the ground. However, within seconds, Oddish was back on her feet and had a green shroud of energy surrounding her as Ash shouted for the use of Absorb. Utilizing the natural power and versatile strength it afforded her, the small and formerly shy pre-evolved form of Vileplume sent several tendrils of energy at her opponent. Taken by surprise at the sudden shift in tactics, Weepinbell hopped back to avoid the first wave of tendrils but then had to instantly jump away again to avoid the occurring salvo. Like a non-stop bombardment. Erica had her Pokémon returning fire by using Razor Leaf as a countermeasure, but that merely turned the battle into a match of power and speed. Neither effort actually managing to hit either Pokémon due to their smaller, quick bodies being able to hurriedly move and evade. Finally, Ash yelled for Oddish to charge in while canceling Absorb, and at the same time, Erica also shouted for her own Pokémon, just as Oddish was upon it, to use a move very few present expected. Stockpile. What? How is that possible? Giselle yelled just as Weepinbell lunged towards Oddish with its mouth wide open to swallow her whole. I didn't think Weepinbell could use Stockpile, only Victorybell. That's not entirely true, Soledad answered as her sharp eyes followed the action of the battle closely. Weepinbell typically can't because it's not overly large itself, and usually size is what allows a Pokémon to use that move. However, Erica must have somehow taught her Weepinbell to use that move specifically on Pokémon smaller than itself, like Oddish. With what could almost comically be described as a ravenous squash eating an onion stalk in any different situation, Weepinbell caught Oddish by total surprise and succeeded in closing its maw, and thereby its entire body, around its smaller opponent. With the proverbial muscles in its mouth working a mile minute, Weepinbell tasked itself with full focus and concentration on swallowing back the now struggling Pokémon inside of its body as hard as it could. Although, apparently it didn't need to actually swallow Oddish completely as Erica yelled again. Weepinbell now use swallow. Mumbling its name around its mouthful, the actual body of Weepinbell began fluctuating and contracting as a blue aura soon began enveloping its form. Realizing this as the energy-sapping properties that Swallow was intended for, Ash proved his ability to be light on his feet in thinking as he went from gritting his teeth in frustration to forming an expression of sudden inspiration. Oddish. If you can hear me, try and fight against the pain and use Razor Leaf. Do it now. What? Erica gasped in shock. From inside of her dark, moving, creepy living prison, Oddish managed to hear her trainer and struggled through the exhaustion she was feeling due to having her energy absorbed. Her effort was rewarded though, as she managed to whip her head back and forth, of which launched several sharp leaves off inside of Weepinbell's body. One could only imagine the pain the bigger grass type felt, on top of the shock, as the extremely sharp leaves began cutting through and shredding its inner flesh, like a steak knife through strips of dough. Seeing its concentration lapse and noticing their opening, Ash gave another command, Oddish now use Absorb. Focusing on all the inner focus and strength she could muster, Oddish cried out from inside of Weepinbell and started to glow a bright green. A glowing aura which could be seen at the edges of Weepinbell's enclosed mouth. Several seconds of tense observation later, by all sides, saw, amazingly enough, Erica's Pokémon beginning to levitate up into the air. Almost as though it were being yanked upon by some invisible string. As it slowly rose higher and higher into the air, Oddish could gradually be seen a little clearer until the entire lower half of her body became completely visible. What was more, as Weepinbell was forcibly removed from around her, Adish's intense and almost sweating face was seen scrunched up as though she were attempting to lift an 80-pound boulder. What happened next could be seen as nothing short of a miracle for the valiant little grass type, as well as far too convenient by the more narrow-minded masses. Instead of bright, light green, Adish's body took on a much darker, forest green aura as the tendrils and shroud of absorb seemed to blaze to life like never before and become even larger. Almost as though it were alive and broiling like stew left on the stove for too long. The sudden upsurge in power caused Weepinbell to get shot straight up into the air and totally off of Adish until it was soon held nearly 6 feet off the ground. With her eyes glowing green and the powerful energy holding Weepinbell up now resembling the tentacles of an octillery, Adish called out her name loudly while Ash yelled in excitement. Yeah, Adish. You just learned Mega Drain. Instinctually knowing exactly how to use the move she had just been blessed by Arceus to learn in her time of desperation, Adish strained her little body and turned up the intensity in her attack as arcing streams of what resembled light blue electricity started lighting up the energy cloud Weepinbell was being held inside of. Fear on its face which soon turned into pain, Weepinbell was helpless to defend itself as the energy-absorbing tendrils of Mega Drain began sapping its very own vitality with harshly damaging bursts of sucking vacuum force. Erika could only watch in dread as her Pokémon was brutally robbed of its very lifeblood until, within several seconds, Weepinbell was laying limply in Adish's ethereal grasp above her head. Showing the might that her stolen energy had gifted her with, Adish leaned back and then grunted before tossing Weepinbell out of the grasp of Mega Drain and across the ground, where it landed limply in front of its trainer. Looking down at her boss's Pokémon, Delilah could see that the final internal Razor Leaf and subsequent Absorb turned Mega Drain had been far too damaging a series of attacks for Weepinbell to sustain. As was made obvious by the vacant look in its eyes. Raising her hand towards Ash and Adish, Erika's friend and employee declared victory for the two of them, which earned a round of cheers from Ash himself, his friends and Pikachu. All this happening as Adish finally returned to normal and then blinked in surprise. As a smiling Erika returned her defeated Pokémon, Ash ran out and scooped Adish up into his arms as he spun her around and laughed. You did it, Adish. I knew you could. I told you how much stronger you were than you thought you could be. Odd. Adish odd. The small grass type chirped happily while kicking her feet in excitement. Pulling out her next Pokeball from inside of her dress sleeve, Erika smirked at Ash and called over to him. You both did well, Ash, and I commend your Adish for overcoming her fear, but this battle is far from over. Tangela, come and fight with me, my friend. With those words spoken, the blue-haired gym leader summoned forth the strange-looking, vine-bodied Pokémon which appeared on the walkway from its Pokeball with a bland announcement of its name. Looking down into his arms at Adish, Ash asked seriously, are you ready to go again or do you want to stop, Adish? Giving a confident, enthusiastic smile up at her trainer, Adish just nodded and then jumped out of his arms before running back onto the makeshift battlefield and then taking a ready position. Smiling at his Pokemon's newfound confidence and enthusiasm, Ash nodded to Delilah, who merely lowered her hands and commanded for the battle to begin. Moving fast and without the need for commands since she knew her trainer would approve of a long-range attack, Adish whipped her head back and forth and sent several sharp leaves flying across the way at Tangela. However, to both she and her trainer's amazement, Erika's Pokémon simply knocked each and every one effortlessly away with several well-timed whips of the many vines that made up its physical body. As soon as the immediate threat had been subdued, Tangela, also without command, sent forth what easily had to have been upwards of 6 to 8 blue vines at Adish. Each one traveling at dizzying speeds too fast for her to keep up with. Ash wanted to say something, anything, to help his Pokémon, but the harsh fact was that Adish was simply too slow, too inexperienced and too nervous now to have a hope in dodging what was coming her way. With a sound like a whip striking a barrel, Adish was hit with the first vine head on, which sent her skidding back. The second vine slapped the side of her face and the third one did the same to the other side. The next 2 vines struck her in the side of the body and the last few hit her straight on, sending Adish flying back across the walkway. Without taking pause, 2 more vines sped towards and picked Adish up before slamming her into the concrete ground, eliciting a pained cry from her before immediately doing so a second time. Deciding to go for broke and do whatever he could to help her, Ash yelled, "Oddish, use razor leaf on those vines and try to free yourself." Squinting an eye open and hearing her trainer, Oddish lifted her head and went to follow through with his command. However, Erica obviously wasn't having any of that as she shouted, "Tangela, throw Oddish into the air." Tangela. The strange grass type vocalized before promptly tossing Ash's Pokémon high into the air and effectively ruining her concentration at the attack she had been about to use. With Oddish airborne and helpless, Erica gave one final command, "Now use Vine Spore." The name of the attack had all but those on Erica's side looking confused, but Tangela showed what the move was in bitter close-up detail seconds later. Calling out its name, a yellowish powder began emitting from within Tangela's body, and as this occurred, the grass Pokémon sent two of its vines up into the air at Oddish. The strangest thing was that as this happened, the yellow powder suffusing Tangela's body followed the vines all the way up into the air and covered them in the same strange powdery glow. As they made contact with Oddish and wrapped themselves tightly around her body, the small Pokémon gasped in pain. Although, the pain soon turned to a strange, almost frozen facial expression as the yellow powder on the vines started to slowly leach off of them and onto her own body, essentially covering Oddish in a shroud of yellow powder. "So that's what she did," Brock exclaimed loudly while looking intently at the action before them. Erica had Tangela use Stun Spore on its body and by extension, its vines, that way whatever they touched would automatically transfer to their target. No one could comment though, because at that same moment, Tangela whipped its vines downward and sent the frozen Oddish flying towards the ground below like a mini rocket falling back to Earth. With a crashing sound that was undoubtedly painful and a cry of pain from Oddish herself that was even worse, Ash and his friends could only look on in distress as the two still glowing vines came hurtling down at the grounded Pokémon and began striking her mercilessly, over and over again. Given that her whole body was paralyzed, Oddish could do nothing but lay there and take the abuse as she was repeatedly assaulted by the vines. That was at least, until the final strike made its dreaded appearance. One more vine shooting out of its body, Tangela sent a fast strike straight at its opponent, knowing she couldn't defend herself. In fact, as the vine made contact with Oddish and sent her flying back into the air and across the walkway towards Ash, most everyone present already knew what to expect when she landed. That assumption was proven correct as Oddish hit the ground hard in front of Ash's feet and lay still, swirls in her eyes and the occasional pained vocalization murmuring forth from her lips as well. Instead of getting angry or freaking out as Delilah gave the battle to Erica and Tangela, Ash just smiled and bent down to pick her up before speaking softly. "Oddish, that was an incredible battle. You did a great job and showed just how strong you are. I'm very proud of you." Returning his beaten Pokémon seconds later, Ash stood back up and pulled out another Pokéball while staring at Tangela across the way. Raising the ball in his hand and then tossing it into the air, Ash had no reason to call out the Pokémon within its name as Roselia soon materialized onto the walkway with a graceful spin and with her flower hands held up just as gracefully in front of her face. Ash could see some surprise on the faces of Erica and her friends at the sight of a native Hoenn Pokémon in their midst, but they didn't speak on it. At least, not Erica. There might have been some whispering amongst the other ladies. Lowering her hands and given the signal for the next round to start, Delilah called for both sides to begin as Erica moved first. Almost as though refusing to give Ash any momentum whatsoever. Calling out for her Pokémon to use another vine assault, Ash and Roselia merely stayed stationary and just waited, patiently, for Tangela to use its obviously favored attack pattern. It soon became obvious that Ash didn't need to give his Pokémon any commands because, like a graceful dancer all but floating across the dance floor itself, Roselia merely waited until the last possible minute and then leapt almost lazily away from the first vine to reach her. The second one she evaded in much the same manner as she simply pirouetted away in a spinning jump, and as for the third vine, the beautiful grass type threw her entire body backwards like she was engaged in a game of limbo. As soon as the last vine passed over her head, Roselia didn't wait for the next attack and instead took off running at near dizzying speeds for her opponent. all the while twisting, turning, spinning and leaping over each and every vine Tangela sent her way. As Ash's Pokémon impressed all those spectating with her grace and elegance in battle, Soledad smiled and crossed her arms. I knew from the first moment I helped train her with Ash on some coordinating drills that Roselia would be a natural at contest battling. Seeing Misty and Giselle looking at her somewhat questioningly from out of her peripheral vision, the light-haired redhead explained her previous statement more fully. Over the last 2 weeks while helping Ash and his Pokémon train in coordinator tactics, especially the ones he selected for this battle, I could tell Roselia would have the natural skill and grace to perform contest routines far easier than others. Soledad's eyes watched the fight intently as Roselia continued to run towards Tangela and the smaller, clumsier Pokémon almost desperately now tried to hit her with its vines. Alas, it was for naught since she simply evaded each vine strike with such ease it was almost as though she were playing with Tangela. Due to Ash's intense training with her, the body weights themselves she trains with notwithstanding, Roselia's speed and agility in battle was already impressive. Once I began showing the two of them how they could really get the most out of that naturally possessed, as well as hard-earned talent, she started showing an adept skill for contest training. Not surprisingly, that also carries over into her normal battling as well. So I'm really not surprised she's doing so well right now. Her eyes then narrowed. I just hope she can keep her sights focused on the battle and doesn't get overconfident like I've seen her having a tendency to do. Soledad's final words seemed to be capped when Roselia finally reached Tangela after evading all of its vines and then jumped up on top of one of them. Raising one of her petaled hands and pointing it at her stunned-looking opponent, Roselia actually appeared to smirk as Ash yelled, "Use magical leaf." Like a funnel of bright rainbow light, Roselia kept her appendage pointed dead at Tangela just as the blue petal she called a hand erupted and sent a deadly swath of razor-sharp, multicolored leaves at Erika's Pokémon. Crying out in agonizing pain, Tangela was sent rocketing off of its red, shooed feet and flew across the concrete walkway like a piece of menial trash being tossed carelessly to the wind. Without stopping, Roselia jumped at her opponent, her silhouette being seen high in the air, and then landed on top of her fellow grass type with a hard thud. Raising both of her petaled hands out in front of her, Roselia didn't need to wait for her trainer's command as she began shooting dozens of sharp projectiles, here meaning razor leaf, straight into the face of the currently downed and stunned Tangela. Hearing her Pokémon cry out in pain as the sharp leaves cut into its vine-covered skin repeatedly, Erika grit her teeth and showed wavering eyes as she frantically thought of some way to save her beleaguered Pokémon. For his part though, Ash wasn't necessarily comfortable with what he was seeing as he shouted, "Roselia, don't get cocky. Pay attention or you're gonna get hurt." Obviously, the female grass Pokémon didn't take her trainer's words seriously since her face was still set into a self-satisfied smirk as she continuously used a double razor leaf from both petals to lay siege to her enemy. Seconds later though, Erika proved Ash's words correct as she suddenly called out, "Tangela, use poison burst." Snapping its eyes open again and staring straight up at its current tormentor even as the leaves continued to cut into its body, Tangela grunted its name and tensed up like a guitar string about to snap. Within seconds, the round Pokémon's body began to glow what almost seemed to be a deep purple and appeared to originate from within its unique, viney anatomical structure. Roselia, however, so confident was she in her victory, didn't realize what had happened until it was too late. Like a Raiden bursting through a steel cage, Tangela suddenly yelled its name and then quite literally erupted into a combination of purple energy and a mess of what seemed like a legion of vines. Caught completely unawares, Roselia was sent flying back off of her formerly beaten down opponent with a haze of the same thick purple spores now covering every inch of her body. As a matter of fact, once she finally hit the ground and let out a loud grunt of pain, it soon became obvious as to just what the purple energy was. Seeing electrical sparks emitting off of his Pokémon's body while Roselia convulsed in pain and struggled to get up off the ground, Ash's eyes widened. No way, she just got poisoned. Indeed, his assumption was correct. Across the walkway, Tangela was now standing up again, but this time, it looked almost like a different Pokémon. As though Erika's Pokémon had somehow grown several sizes bigger than it had been previously, it seemed like all of the vines that made up Tangela's body was now in action and moving of their own free will. Acting like they were indeed of one mind, similar to a Ninetales' tails or Octillery's tentacles, each and every one of Tangela's vines were now extended out of its body and reaching high into the air at all sides. In all actuality, it almost seemed like Tangela's body had went from small and compact to wild and untamed, like a wall of jungle vines. What was even more, its entire body was glowing the same bright purple that was now afflicting Roselia's own form. In some strange way it was almost ominous, like a shroud of angry, vengeful energy that only cared about one thing, wreaking havoc on the one who had pushed it to such an extreme. Tangela's eyes also now seemed to be located right in the center of its body, concealed somewhere in the blackness beyond. In summary, whatever form the formerly small and uninteresting Pokémon had now taken was nothing short of pure unnerving. Seeing the looks of awe on everyone's faces that had not witnessed Tangela take such a form before, Erika began speaking from across the walkway. I trained Tangela to learn how to manipulate and control each and every vine in its body, both independently as well as in unison with one another. What you're seeing right now is his strongest technique, with every vine that gives Tangela life now awakened and serving the same collective conscious for battle. Before Ash could respond or have time to process what Erika just said, the blue-haired Celadon gym leader raised her hand and commanded authoritatively, showing no signs of the sweet and kind young woman that she commonly portrayed. Tangela use Vine Barrage. Tangela Tang. The grass-type voiced in assent as what looked like dozens of vines came angrily bursting forth from its currently oversized body and headed for the still struggling Roselia. Quick! Stand up and get out of the way, Roselia. Ash yelled to his Pokémon. You gotta move. Unfortunately, due to the poison coursing through her system, courtesy of the purple spores now covering Tangela's body after its earlier successful attempt at turning the tables on her, Roselia was powerless to move herself out of the way. This inability proved to be her worst chance of misfortune as the multiple thick blue vines descended upon her like an angry swarm and began battering Ash's Pokémon in a fierce barrage of vicious smacks, hammers and whipping strikes. Feeling the pain inside of her body from the poison only being increased tenfold due to the beating she was now suffering, Roselia could only stand and take her punishment as she was battered back and forth, up and down, side to side and down into the ground, repeatedly. It appeared that Tangela was enjoying wreaking its revenge on the one who had caused it so much pain earlier as it suddenly grabbed onto the now bruised and battered Roselia and lifted her high into the air. With the loud echoing of painful thuds soon filling the air, Ash watched helplessly as his Pokémon was repeatedly slammed into the ground over and over again by Tangela's powerful vines. The sounds of pain and agony she released with every impact being all the reason he needed to immediately begin racking his brain for some way to help his Pokémon. Eventually, after several seconds of watching Roselia get brutalized by Tangela's vines, the poison burning through her system like a rebel force all the while, Ash shifted his gaze to Erika's Pokémon itself and just stared at it for several moments without blinking. Thankfully, as though struck by a lightning bolt of inspiration, the palette native suddenly had an idea force itself into his head. Albeit a long-shot plan if there ever was one, but, given the current stakes and lack of any other viable way out, he was willing to go off of his possibly flawed logic if it helped Roselia. Listen to me. He yelled pleadingly to his battered friend as Roselia was bashed into the ground again. Roselia, I need you to muster up all the power and strength you have left and channel it into Giga Drain. Do it right now. Don't aim it, just let it go like an eruption. Shifting one of her pain-filled eyes towards her trainer, the now adequately humbled grass type gave a small nod and then focused ahead at her opponent. Just as Tangela raised her into the air again with the intent to throw her back into the ground, Roselia called on all of the energy she had remaining as her entire body began glowing like a bright green furnace. Her face scrunched up in effort and her voice straining under the strain of what she was about to do, Roselia managed to do what she had been commanded just as her body was being flung back to the earth again with the intent of putting her down for the count. Eyes snapping and glowing with the intense power of raw nature, Roselia cried her name to the heavens above as an explosion of bright green energy erupted outward from her body, acting like a dome that gradually expanded more and more before bursting like a needle to a balloon. In an astonishing spectacle that truly was once in a very small handful of battles, the powerful green energy Roselia released started to charge up through the vines holding her and all the way back to Tangela. Just as stunned as its trainer at the unexpected turn of events, the uniquely created by Arceus Pokémon had no time to react before the foreign energy connected with its main body and instantly caused Tangela to lock up like it was paralyzed. The purple spore haze of poison powder disappearing from around its bloated form and being replaced by that of a shroud of broiling green energy, Tangela soon knew exactly what it was feeling after the shock of the moment passed. And that was pain. Pure, unbridled pain that was accompanied by it feeling as though its vitality and life force was being forcibly stolen away from its very spirit. Every vine in Tangela's body became rigid and taut at the same time as sparks of electrical energy started arcing around its body, quickly followed by loud cries of pain escaping from the Pokémon's mouth, wherever that actually was. Standing up slowly by harnessing every ounce of strength and willpower remaining in her body, Roselia narrowed her eyes onto her stricken opponent before glancing back to her trainer. A silent communication passing between the two of them that Ash was able to understand was her silently telling him that she had realized the error of her conceited, cocky ways after enduring such an embarrassing beating. He nodded and slowly smiled. Through the bond he shared with all of his Pokémon, the young man was able to feel the change in heart Roselia had seemingly developed throughout the course of the long, hard battle. And that change of heart made his own warm with pride as he raised his hand and pointed with a newfound feeling of intensity welling in his gut. Roselia. Let's end this right here and now. Without needing to hear his command, Roselia shot off as fast as her beaten body could take her towards Tangela, whom was still being thoroughly tormented in the most painful of ways by the uncontrolled Giga Drain its opponent had used to free herself. Jumping into the air with both petal hands raised before her, Roselia started descending towards Tangela while her appendages began glowing. Just before she could make contact and while still several feet from her enemy, Roselia let the final attack she had stored up go just as Ash shouted, "Roselia, use magical leaf." Calling out her name as a form of defiance to the one who had almost beaten her, Roselia's body was actually sent flying back into the air due to the force in which the aforementioned attack came exploding forth from her petals. Within barely a second Tangela became obscured in a vortex of glowing leaves that completely obscured its form and soon began emitting a loud swooshing, slicing sound from within the funnel. However, in an unexpected turn of events, the leaves that were being ejected from the still airborne Roselia's petals changed color and shape seemingly in an instant. Instead of glowing and numbering in the dozens and dozens, the leaves dropped in number and returned to their original green color, but instead of quantity, the size of the leaves themselves seemed to almost double. As the funnel of glowing leaves trapping Tangela turned into loud, crashing constant impacts, Ash clenched his fist out in front of him and shouted with a smile up to his Pokémon. "Roselia, yeah. You just learned Leaf Storm." Her body being constantly kept elevated up in the air due to the sheer force in which the now oversized leaves were being ejected from her petals, Roselia didn't let up for a second and continued to rain leafy fury down onto her opponent. The cloud of dust and debris from the crater that was now surely forming only growing bigger the longer she kept up her relentless assault. After several long moments of this, Roselia finally dropped back to the ground and panted heavily with exhaustion as the massacre came to an end. Together, she and Ash, as well as everyone else observing, kept their eyes on the white cloud of smoke to see just what had become of Tangela. For far too long it seemed than any of them were prepared for, the haze finally lifted, and when it did, they were all treated to the sight of something in which both amazed, as well as majorly creeped out in certain cases, the spectators on both sides of the walkway. There, laying in a sizable crater dented into the concrete pathway that lead to the gym, with its many vines scattered all around it, was Tangela. Only, it wasn't necessarily all that recognizable anymore. For so long people, trainers and non-alike, had wondered in passing just what a Pokémon like Tangela would look like under all of its vines. And now, sprawled out undeniably unconscious on the walkway serving as a battlefield, a few select individuals were given that answer. Due to the fierce internal warfare that had been waged on it from within thanks to the powerful Giga Drain, not to mention a brutal external attack in the form of magical leaf-turned-leaf storm, all courtesy of Roselia, Tangela's already vulnerable physical form had been assaulted violently during the unwavering onslaught it endured. In many ways, while the final, end-all, technique Erica had her Pokémon use by unraveling all of the vines from its body to use in battle was indeed powerful and effective, it came at a great cost. This basically meant that by using all of its vines, which essentially made up its very physical structure, as a mobile fighting force, it also made them very vulnerable and weak to attack. The internal and external combination onslaught Tangela had suffered in the form of Giga Drain and Leaf Storm earlier was simply all that had been needed to weaken the strength of its vines to hold their constant tight coil shape. Which was needed to keep Tangela's core body safe and protected from outside threats. Now, with all of that temporarily thrown out the window so to speak, what lay beneath was now visible. Amazingly enough, Tangela's actual body was just a black, spindly spool structure of sorts with eyes fitted into the top of it. The vines themselves apparently wrapped around the black spool like a ball of yarn and simply made multiple tight wrappings around it until Tangela